Welcome to the Filmlings Podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 54, The HITCH-HIKE Villains.
Or really just psychopaths and sociopaths. I don't know. There's one who might be a sociopath. We'll see.
Yeah, but nonetheless, they are all fairly intelligent, no matter how distorted that intelligence is. And Hitchcock lets us in way into their thought process. And that is going to be very interesting to talk about today.
Yeah, certainly. So let's talk about the movies we're going to talk about today as we go through the darkest parts of Hitchcock's canon. So first up is Strangers on a Train from 1951, based on the book called Strangers on a Train by Patricia Highsmith. And this one was nominated for an Oscar for Best Black and White Cinematography. It's got some really beautiful stuff in there for all the amusement park scenes with glowing lights and string lights. It's really beautiful. That's the first one we're going to be talking about today.
Even just the way he films shoes in that film in black and white is kind of amazing.
Yes, it's incredibly enjoyable. Very, very. There's a lot to learn, even if you're going to be shooting in color photography, looking at a black and white film that is as gorgeous as Strangers on a Train.
Right. And then next in 1954, we're looking at Dial M for Murder, based on a stage play from 1952 named the same by Friedrich Knott. And it was actually shot in 3D. It's considered one of the better 3D movies ever made, which may just be because it's like a Hitchcock movie and it's really good. And it just happens to be in 3D. And it won a BAFTA for Best Foreign Actress for Grace Kelly, who we talked about last week and we'll talk about again next week.
Did you know that Grace Kelly would go on to be like the Princess of Monaco?
Yes, I did. She had quite an incredible life.
Yes, until it ended tragically. But that's a story for a different podcast. Also, did you know that Hitchcock did not like Dial M for Murder? That's a story for this podcast, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But the last film we are going to be talking about today is Psycho. Cue the string music, from 1960. And that is based on the book Psycho by Robert Bloch. And it really cleaned up at the Oscars. It won Best Director for Alfred Hitchcock, Best Black and White Cinematography. And this was the last black and white film that Hitchcock shot, actually. Also sometimes considered, or close to the end of his peak career. Maybe not the end of the career. I think we said Marnie was the line.
There's The Birds is still after this, so I think he still has a couple more in there.
Yeah. It also won Best Supporting Actress for Janet Leigh and Best Black and White Art Set Decoration.
Absolutely. And this is after Vertigo. So, obviously the black and white is a very intentional choice because he's already made one of his most effective color films at this point. So he's just proving that, color is a story choice like anything else. And I mean, we've already been talking about this a lot, but that's something that we seem to have lost. But we can get to that when we get to Psycho.
Yeah, that and some chocolate syrup to top it all off. But first, let's talk about Strangers on a Train from 1951. And this is a movie that is about two strangers on a train. So our first stranger on the train is a tennis player by the name of Guy Haynes. And Guy Haynes is in a bit of a bind. He is married to essentially his high school sweetheart, at least young love sweetheart, but they're pretty much estranged. His wife is pregnant by another man. He wants to get a divorce so he can marry the woman he loves, but obviously his current wife is making that difficult for him. And she's definitely portrayed as an antagonist for as long as she's in the movie for. And the woman he wants to marry, Anne, is the daughter of a powerful senator. He clearly loves Anne, but he also is kind of interested in having a future political career. The sinner is a bit of a character in the movie. And of course, there's also Anne's sister, Barbara, who's played by none other than Alfred Hitchcock's daughter, Pat Hitchcock, who appears in one other movie that we have today. The other stranger on the train is Bruno. And Bruno is a crazy person with mama problems, to say the least. He is our psychopath of the film, hands down, for sure. He is a very, very rich. He's a rich kid. He's not a kid in age, but mentally he acts like a child. He's got a very close relationship with his mother, but not in a healthy way, like kind of in a codependent way. Even though his mom isn't that assertive of a person, his father, though, is a domineering person and kind of like, reigns over Bruno's life, and Bruno does not like him. They do not get along. It's a very messed up family. Like, it takes all of 5 minutes, or less than 5 minutes, 5 seconds within the first scene that you see of his family to realize that, like, these are not mentally healthy, emotionally healthy people. They have problems with each other. And one of Bruno's problems is that he always fantasizes about the perfect murder. And when he stumbles upon Guy on this train, he pitches the idea of the perfect murder to him after recognizing, one, who Guy is in the sports pages, and two, knowing about his personal problems from the gossip pages. And thinking this might be a reasonable candidate for this. And essentially his idea for the perfect murder is that two strangers agree to murder somebody that the other guy wants dead. So Bruno would have Guy kill his father, and Guy would have Bruno kill his estranged wife. And Guy thinks that Bruno is joking and doesn't take him seriously, but Bruno thinks that Guy agreed to the plot. And also,
because he kind of laughs him off. He's like, "Sure, that's a great idea."
Thinking, no, there's no way anybody's serious about this. They'd have to be a psychopath to go through with that. And, well, I mean...
But by saying sure, like, technically he kind of gave consent, and our psychopathic character didn't totally understand the sarcasm.
Mm-hmm. So be careful what you say, kids, to strangers on trains. But Bruno also leaves his cigarette lighter behind, like his monogram cigarette lighter, on the train, and Bruno keeps it. Bruno goes on to kill Guy's wife in a wonderfully choreographed scene, or pursuit scene through a amusement park, which will become a central location of the film. And then goes and tells Guy about it, and Guy's like, "What the heck? I didn't ask you to do that." And of course, there's a back and forth argument. The rest of the film is kind of spent in this tension between the two characters. Bruno trying to pressure Guy into going through with killing his father, and Guy trying to, one, get out of this deal with Bruno and get Bruno to go away, and two, not be caught by the cops, who are clearly suspicious of the estranged husband when the wife turns up dead. Like, that's a pretty simple lead. And of course, we end in a fantastic chase scene back through the amusement park again. And I won't give away the lead up to it because it's delicious to see it unravel. And I won't give away the finale either, because spoilers. You'll enjoy it a whole bunch, though. It's really beautiful. It's really fun to watch, and wonderful, tense, suspenseful filmmaking on the part of Alfred Hitchcock.
Right. And just to get it out of the way, the cameo in this movie comes at 10 minutes and 34 seconds. And Hitchcock is boarding the train, and he's holding a big instrument case, a double bass, when Guy is getting off the train. And for some reason, he often has musical instrument cases. I don't know what that is, but if you want to make some kind of connection to him being like the composer or the maestro of a film, I think that's pretty appropriate.
I could see that. I could also see Hitchcock just thinking it's funny for whatever reason that Hitchcock finds things funny, and just doing it. I could totally see it. And again, we already mentioned this, but his daughter's in the film too, which he would go on to have her in one or two other of his films and several episodes of his TV show, Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Yeah, but this is probably her biggest role in a movie, and she's actually like pretty hilarious. She has a really funny role in Psycho too that we'll talk about, but she has a much bigger role in this film as the sister of Guy's love interest, and she's like all for Guy. She's like backing him up on everything, and I don't know, she just has a lot of personality on screen.
She's a very likable character, and she roots for the guy that we want to like. So, so that makes her incredibly sympathetic to us as an audience, and we very much like her. Whereas she's kind of a joke in Psycho.
Yeah, she is. But another character actor in this movie that we should bring up, because we've seen him twice now, is Leo Carroll, who is the father, the politician, and he was our nefarious doctor in Spellbound, and also the CIA, FBI, whatever government agent in North by Northwest. So we're pretty familiar with him at this point, and even if he's not like one of Hitchcock's recurring leading men, he's definitely a recurring character actor for Hitchcock. So, just building that, group of people that Hitchcock works with a lot, you could throw him in the mix.
Right. And of course, we should talk about this week our things Alfred Hitchcock is afraid of. As we talked about in the Wrong Man episode, a lot of his movies are the wrong man plot, and a big reason for that is that that's one of his biggest fears. He was really afraid of just kind of being misconstrued by the police. Like, that is a danger fantasy that he was terrified of, and whether or not this is one of the bigger personal fears for him, this movie is definitely kind of motivated by a similar situation. But instead of it's the wrong man plot where you are being misunderstood, although that is kind of worked into this plot. Really, this
in a kind of twisted way.
Yeah, really, this is kind of about the stranger as being dangerous. Like those people that you see every day, that guy who you might bump into on the train. Is he just a stranger, or is he that guy who's going to ruin your life? Although, ironically, in this film, quick spoiler warning, things turn out pretty well for the protagonist.
Right, eventually.
His wife's dead at the end of the film, so she's no longer in the way, and the guy who's been tormenting him is dead, and he's not in jail. And
right.
I'm like, wow, he came out of that with everything he wanted. But before that, it's this twisted fantasy of what if this innocent conversation that you assume to be innocent is suddenly takes over your life, and presents itself as this danger, this unexpected danger from this unexpected source.
And I think there's a really interesting contrast that Hitchcock throws into this movie, because we start with this first conversation on the train where Bruno and Guy are talking, and Bruno just lays out his whole plan and exactly how everything needs to go down and all that, which is something that we'll talk about for sure in Dial M for Murder, because that is the driving force of the plot, is just knowing exactly what the bad guy is planning. But the other thing, so we have that element of, okay, this conversation with a stranger on a train got wildly out of hand. But then at the moment that Bruno is strangling Guy's wife, Guy is on a different train, or actually probably just a bus. And he runs into this other guy, this drunk professor guy who's rambling on about math or some theory that he's come up with and just gave a lecture on. And he goes, "Do you understand what I'm talking about?" And Guy's like, "Oh, yeah, of course I do." He's like, "What?" And so that ends up actually getting rolled into the wrong man plot, because that's his alibi, and ends up being, he doesn't remember anything that happened. But it's also, it kind of mirrors the same kind of conversation where this guy is rambling on about something that he's very passionate about that Guy doesn't care about, and is just kind of like, "Oh yeah, sure, whatever." He has basically the same reaction to it, and that is your ordinary scenario. And then you have it contrasted with the darkest possible version of that scenario. And so I think that Hitchcock throwing in these parallels and this kind of almost poetic aspect into this movie.
Yeah, and it's like this cautionary tale against half-heartedly engaging with strangers.
Right.
Or either engage with them or don't. But if you halfway engage with them, you never know. They might murder your estranged wife, and then you could be accused for the crime. It
like they said they would.
Yeah, no, it could happen. And of course, I want to talk about the way the plot is structured in this movie because it's something we're going to see in another one of the movies today, and something we see in a lot of Hitchcock films that aren't the wrong man plot, aren't the chase plot. And that is a crime movie. And not in the sense of like a heist movie where it's like, how do they pull it off? But a sense of like this mystery suspense thriller where you end up retracing the crime over and over and over and over. And that happens in this movie, and we're going to see it again here just a second to a much larger extent in Dial M for Murder, where the details of the crime become the details of the plot, and they get rehashed and more new meaning gets put on them again and again, in this really interesting way to build suspense and interest and really make crime the theme of the movie.
Yeah, and it's something that we've talked about before as far as how Hitchcock reveals information. You know, he doesn't keep a lot of times he doesn't keep the bad guy's plot a secret when there is one. He tells us, that way we are anticipating every moment of it happening, and you know, when something goes wrong or something like that, then we're kind of on the edge of our seat, but we know what's supposed to be happening. So we're following along. Either you know, he does the other thing where basically, you know, you're kind of at some point you're kind of rooting for the bad guy because you know what he's doing, and you're expecting it to go well, and you don't know what kind of kinks are going to be thrown into the gears of this plan. So it's just all these dynamics of anticipation that Hitchcock is able to build just by telling us the plan at the beginning of the movie, and that we're going to see like is able to even carry an entire film in our next movie.
Yeah, and it really is like, if you want to stick it into, if you're not going to stick it into like the psycho genre, then you'd have to stick it into like the perfect crime thriller subgenre, where the goal of the movie is to see whether or not the perfect crime can take place. And one of the characters starts off with the idea of like, this is what a perfect crime would be, and let's try to pull it off. And that's actually a recurring theme in a lot of Hitchcock's canon. We see it here. We see it in Dial M for Murder. We're going to see it next week in one of the movies that we're going to cover that I won't tell you quite yet, but I'm sure if you're familiar with Hitchcock's canon, you can guess, where the suspense is the will they get away with it aspect rather than the will they be exonerated aspect of his wrong man plots.
And it's interesting because in our last film today, Psycho, that's not even kind of part of the question, but our bad guy does a better job of getting away with it than either of the bad guys in these movies, even though they're like, that's not even part of the question in their brain.
Right. It's kind of this tale of hubris, right? Like, because the idea, I mean, the thing that you come away with at the end of almost every perfect crime movie, and especially Hitchcock's movies, is this idea that the perfect crime is not a real thing. And like this, I don't want to call them heroes, but maybe a protagonist starts off the film with this foible, this Greek hubris idea that they can pull it off, that they're so smart that they can pull it off, or they're so clever that they can pull it off, and then they end up not being quite as smart because you can never fully predict what's going to happen. And it's almost like a weird reverse Greek tragedy where you're happy to see the guy get put away, but at the same time, there's part of you that kind of wants to see like, oh, how are they actually going to be clever enough to pull this off? I would be interested to see that. In this weird way that we're obsessed with crime as humans, and the reason that there's like a true crime genre of podcasts and movies and all that sorts of stuff. Like, this is fascinating. That central question is so persistent that it can drive whole movies.
Yeah, and it's kind of an interesting question in all three of these movies that it brings up as far as, and we talked about this last week too with anti-heroes. And the thing is that I think last week we defined the protagonist as the driver of the story, even if they're not the most sympathetic. And yet in all of these movies, the driver of the story is what we would, just jump to think of as the antagonist, the bad guy. And so it's kind of weird because you don't think about it. In Strangers in a Train, at least, we have a more defined protagonist because it's a two-hander between Guy and Bruno. Even though Bruno is the one instigating Guy, he's definitely more the antagonist. But in the other two, it's a little different. But still, Bruno is still like driving the plot, so he's kind of half the protagonist. We just consider him the antagonist because his driving force is, morally wrong as far as anyone is concerned.
Yeah, I think we almost have to apply like a further descriptor when we're talking about protagonists and antagonists, because there's always somebody who's going to be. So yes, there's going to be somebody who's driving the central plot of the movie, but there's also going to be somebody who's instigating the story and somebody who's responding to the story. There's going to be somebody who's going to be aggressive and somebody who's going to be defensive in the back and forth. And while in this one, I think we can say that Guy is probably if we had to pick one, I would say that Guy's the protagonist. Right. Just because he's responding to all the outside forces, and he's clearly the sympathetic character of the film that we're following, and we're supposed to at least be sympathetic towards, if not rooting for. And Bruno would be the antagonist, but Bruno's very much the aggressive character in this film, and Guy is very much the responsive, defensive character in this film. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you're going to have a film where it's the good guy who sets out on this quest and is trying to be stopped by a bad guy, an antagonist, over the course of the film. So this is an interesting film where we have this blurred line between who's the aggressive one, who's the defensive one, who's the protagonist, who's the antagonist. Are they both protagonists and antagonists?
Right. And I think another thing you can throw into the mix, just to fling it back to high school English, is, the idea of the character arc, like which character changes more, because usually the antagonist is a pretty rigid character personality, and we can get into movies that have more developed characters and stuff like that, but in general your protagonist is the one that's going to go through some kind of change in themselves by the end. And I think Guy is, even though, like you said, by the end, what he wanted is accomplished. His wife isn't around anymore, and he's got all his doors open to him because he's not in prison for her murder. But still, he is the one that's more, pliable as far as character development in this, because as he's going through this, he's like thinking about like, okay, how responsible am I in this, and how can I make it right? And so he's processing through all of this, whereas Bruno's just like, what? Just kill my father. Just, we said this thing, we're going to do it. And, he doesn't change throughout the film as far as his intentions and goals.
Yeah. He's definitely the more pliable one. Plus, he's alive at the end.
Right. Well, yeah, that helps too.
So, so technically Bruno changes in a big way, but his character doesn't change in a big way. Mm-hmm. That transition from being alive to being dead is normally quite a shock to people.
Yeah, and it's brought about because of his unwillingness to change his motivations at all.
Yeah, he doesn't change, and then suffers the consequences. Plus, he also committed a murder and suffered the consequences. And this is 1951, like Hays Code. Hitchcock was one of the best around at getting stuff by the censors, but there's still like, even at the point where somebody is skilled enough to get around the censors, there's still, on some level, like the zeitgeist about the movie making industry where bad guys have to be punished. And that's not going to happen in every film, but if it's enough of a norm, then, It makes sense for it to happen in a movie. It's not surprising in any way. It's pretty. I
think in this case, it's a satisfying way to put things together, and it's a little different when we get to Psycho, but it's still.
Yeah, and it does. You're right. It makes perfect sense in this movie. It's not like a non sequitur. It doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel like it was put in there by the censors. But it just it works, and he's dead.
Yeah.
There you go.
So one little just directorial thing that I want to pull out of the Hitchcock Truffaut interview, once again, sponsored by Truffaut himself. Thank you.
Thanks, Truffaut.
Hitchcock talks about the final scene in this film, which is really kind of an amazing climax at this carnival. And, how can you go wrong with a climax at a carnival? I feel like every film that comes to a head in some kind of, entertainment arena just is just kind of pumped up a level.
The lighting is always going to be on point. Those string lights, though, they're beautiful.
Right. But at some point, there is an old man who is he's one of the workers at the carnival, and he's trying to stop this out of control merry-go-round. And so he crawls under there and tries to stop it, and then the merry-go-round ends up, coming unhinged and does this whole thing. But this is one of the things that Hitchcock actually points out as one of his biggest mistakes as a director, because he actually had the guy. I mean, they dug the ground out a little bit, but he was actually under this spinning merry-go-round, and if he had lifted his head like an inch or two higher, I mean, it would have not been good for anyone's insurance. Yeah, it's interesting to hear him say that. Like, this is something that I should have never put him in this situation where it is so dangerous. And we've talked about that before as far as how directors treat their actors and stuff. And this was definitely kind of a learning experience for Hitchcock as far as how you need to make your climax exciting, but you need to keep all of your actors safe. At the same time.
Yeah, keep them alive. Before we move on to Dial M for Murder, Jonathan, I just wanted to let you know this is interesting over here. I'm actually sponsored by Truffaut this week too, as both of us now. Not the podcast, just both of us individually. And so every time I say Truffaut's name, I get a little notification on my Venmo app that he's just deposited more money in my account. So I'm just going to say Truffaut a few more times here. Truffaut. Ooh, sweet.
I can just imagine Truffaut using Venmo to pay you.
Right.
All right. So moving on to our second film. And at this point, I must warn you to put on your 3D headphones before continuing this podcast, because we are talking about Dial M for Murder, Hitchcock's only 3D film, which is completely irrelevant to this conversation. But basically, the film, as we've been alluding to with the last film, we start off with Gene Kelly and her husband, Margot and Tony Wendis. And we find out through a bunch of conversations. This is what we're going to call a chamber piece, which is basically means that for the most part, this film takes place in one room. It's just a little apartment room. So it's this very contained story, and practically all of the suspense and the information comes through dialogue. So if you are adverse to exposition, leave now, because there's a lot of it. It actually,
it's not that dry of a movie. Like, really, it
really isn't. It's amazing how it works.
The camera does all of the work. Like that between the camera and the actors, like it works. It works. If you want to learn how to move a camera, watch Dial M for Murder.
Right. So basically, we start off and we learn that Grace Kelly had at some point, her husband was a tennis player, and he was traveling doing tennis matches and stuff like that. And eventually, Grace Kelly met this other man, and they kind of had this fling, and they wrote a bunch of letters back and forth. And one of the letters survived. And I'm going to try not to get into details, because this movie is like so full of details that we'll be here for as long as it takes to watch the movie. But anyway, they had a fling. There was some evidence of this fling. The husband found out about the fling, but he didn't let on about it. He found the evidence of it in this letter and kept it. And then he finds an old classmate of his who he has a lot of dirt on, as far as knowing how he's stealing from people and kind of scamming these old ladies out of their money and all this kind of stuff. So he talks his old classmate, Swan, into murdering his wife. And he has the perfect plan for it. And he lays out every single step of this plan. which importantly involves the husband, leaving the key under the mat on the stairs of their apartment. And then he will call the apartment at 11 o'clock or midnight or something. And so his wife, who stayed at home, will come to the phone and answer it, while the murderer behind the curtain will strangle her. And then he will leave and make it look like someone came in and stole some stuff and killed her and left. But things do not go as planned. And it's also important to know that the Grace Kelly's love interest, who ends up in town and at their apartment, they don't know that the husband knows about their thing at this time. But he is a mystery writer of all things, and so they have some fun conversations about how you can come up with as many good ideas for a perfect murder on paper as you want, but they don't always go off the right way. And that foreshadows us for exactly what does happen, because Grace Kelly has left a pair of scissors on the desk where she's being strangled, and she stabs them into the back of her assailant, who ends up dying from his wounds after dramatically falling on the scissors.
A real quick fun fact about that scene: it actually took them like a week to shoot it, because it was hard to get the gleam on the scissors right for whatever reason. I think, just because you have two people struggling, they have to hold that in this wide shot, because you're going to keep it in the wide shot. They don't really go to a close-up. And to hold it in the right mark to get the gleam right, but have that light that's casting the gleam not ruin the rest of the shot. It's quite hard. It took a while. But they had to get it right, because, as Hitchcock said, there wasn't enough gleam on the scissors, and a murder without gleaming scissors is like asparagus without the hollandaise sauce. Tasteless.
Well, there you have it. Make sure that those scissors are gleaming, people. But anyway, so after the husband comes back and finds out that, oh my gosh, my wife is not dead and the guy that I sent to kill her is dead, he has to quickly change gears, because he's got to call the police, or else things are going to be very suspicious. So he decides that he's going to frame Swan as the guy who found this letter, because it had been stolen at some point by him. But he frames him as a blackmailer that his wife has killed intentionally, and he can't really say that because he has to look like he's consoling his wife and everything. And it's this really intricate dance with the character and the dialogue of him, looking like this, putting on this facade of comforting his wife and trying to get her acquitted, while at the same time underhandedly planting evidence and making everything point to her as, having done this as first-degree murder, which eventually comes off, and she gets sentenced to capital punishment, actually, which was a little surprising. It was in a very dramatic scene, like pretty much the only scene that takes place outside of the apartment. But one of the detectives starts to figure it out, and then they go through this whole routine of basically proving that the key was still under the mat, because the husband had taken the key from the killer, but it actually wasn't the key that he was looking for. So
it's incredibly intricate. It is very intricate. I've seen this movie maybe 3 times now, and every time it's very hard for me to follow, but the characters are so into it, and the camera is so reassuring in where it looks, to follow along with the characters' stories that they're telling, that it works. Yeah. Even though I can't reproduce the story for you now from my own mouth, you can follow it. So don't feel disparaged about tackling this movie.
And just describing it, it does sound kind of dry, because it is a lot of characters sitting around and talking, but, following along with what they're saying, and, he's planned out every step of this murder, so we know all the details, and then watching as the plan unravels and then derails, and then the husband has to switch gears, and you can watch him thinking and planning and on the spot. And so you're really tense for this guy who's trying to get away with something terrible. And another thing I actually want to throw into this is the fact that the wife kind of is an anti-hero in the fact that, she has cheated on her husband and was carrying on with this guy, even though they've kind of stopped. But that is something that would probably put her off as an unsympathetic character in another movie. But if you contrast that with how terrible the husband's reaction is, she becomes the character that we're sympathetic for and rooting for. Plus just how charming her love interest is and everything. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is that the husband is very charming too.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're all so English. They're so English. Right. So English. Right. But also, Hitchcock loves casting blondes as victims. And
he's got Grace Kelly in here again, so you can't really go wrong.
Yeah, and he does everything you can as a director to make her come across as very innocent, as very much the victim, as she ends up being, like clearly, mm-hmm. like at the point where her murder is being plotted, she is the victim, and Hitchcock does everything a director can do to put us in her sympathy corner.
Yeah,
sympathy corner. That's a good term. I'm going to use that.
But I think that that charmingness of the characters is another thing that applies in all three of these films as far as Hitchcock villains, which is that for the most part, Hitchcock villains are very relatable and sympathetic, at least to begin with. Like they are intelligent. Like we know where they are coming from, at least by the end of the film, like in Psycho. But, in Dial M for Murder is like, this is a very rational, intelligent human being who has thought through every single thing. He doesn't have these.
I'd say he's intelligent. I don't know if I'd say he's rational.
Okay, that's true. But I mean, he is going through everything very logically, as logically as possible, just without the element of, compassion and stuff like that. But, he, for all intents and purposes, he doesn't seem sociopathic and disturbed like Bruno. And he doesn't have like any really major issues like in Psycho, hence the title. But he's just like an intelligent, for all intents and purposes, normal human being who has taken a hurt and taken far too drastic measures accordingly.
Oh, yeah, he's completely sinister. I mean, he seems to know the difference between right and wrong. He seems, like you said, like he seems to completely understand how society works, how other people work. He predicts other people's actions startlingly well. I mean, not 100%.
That's the scariest part of him, though, I think.
Yeah. Oh, that's what makes him so frightening, is that he isn't like dislocated from reality. He knows what he's doing is wrong.
He's like a master chess player.
Yeah.
Is kind of how I would look at him.
He's completely sinister. He plays the intelligent victim or villain very, very well. And, his key flaw is that he thinks he's smarter than everybody else.
Right. Which is not a very sympathetic character trait. And is one of the things that puts him in the antagonist category, because he is so, I think that's a good thing that I hadn't thought about, is like he's very condescending in the way that he approaches everybody, thinking that, he can get away with things that no one else could. And that kind of, he's putting himself on a plane above everybody, including the audience, which does not make us like him very much.
Oh, yeah, not at all, which is key. Like, I mean, heck, we even feel more sympathy for Swan, who is the guy who actually tries to commit the murder because he's been bent over a barrel by this guy.
Yeah, he's essentially being blackmailed into murder, which is a really interesting concept that is like even fully fleshed out in this film.
Yeah, and even though we feel sympathy for him for being blackmailed for murder, like the things he's being blackmailed for, and they go into that, are really bad in their own right, but they're so distant because they're being listed off. They're just being listed off by this guy. And the guy who's doing the listing off is doing something so sinister right in front of our eyes that we side with poor Swan, who, even though he's done bad things to get himself into this position, is now being disastrously manipulated by this evil, arrogant, not quite as smart as he thinks, but still really intelligently sinister villain.
Yeah, which brings up one of Hitchcock's, his phrase for the day. It seems like every episode has one of his catchphrases that is kind of driving it. And this one is, the stronger the villain, the stronger the picture. And this film has a very strong villain, just because he's so cool and composed in a very, kind of just frightening, from like a menacing kind of a way. And I think that just having him is kind of like an experiment about, just having this really cold and calculating and completely planned out villain drives the entire picture and makes an otherwise expositional and talky and boring film really intriguing and interesting to watch.
Yeah, and in contrast to our last film, Strangers on Train, where we talked about the stranger, literally stranger danger. I've been trying not to say stranger danger this entire podcast, but I give up. The last film where we talked about stranger danger, in this film, it's very much, because it's a chamber piece, it's small and it's intimate and all the characters know each other. It's very much a family piece. It's all about the familiar as danger. Like for most of the movie, Grace Kelly's character does not suspect her husband until like the
Right.
very, very end. And it's kind of shocking. It's very shocking to her actually when she kind of finally unravels this mystery, that something so close to her could be dangerous. And again, this is one of those fears that Hitchcock likes to make a centerpiece of a movie that isn't like outlandish. It's very down to earth and it can be very believable because it does happen. Now, I will say it's very unlikely. You're probably not in any danger from your immediate family members. But, the thought that you might be is incredibly deeply scary. And it's one of those fears that can stick with you long after you leave the movie theater. It's why after you watch a Hitchcock movie about a wrong man, you think about what you would do in the scenario where you were accused of a crime you didn't commit. Or after you watch Strangers on the Train, you wonder...
Because that's even rolled into this as far as Grace Kelly becomes the wrong woman, but she's just like, it's a very intentional placing her in that position, and we're on the other side of it. We are watching her being put in the wrong woman position.
Oh yeah, yeah. We're very much on the viewing the whole thing from the bad guy's side. He's kind of the guy driving the whole film,
Right.
Even though Grace Kelly is the victim and he's the villain. And again, these are two fears that we already talked about today. The fear, stranger danger fear, and I don't want to say fear of family because that sounds sad, but it's true. Fear of the familiar, fear of those close to you.
No, but I mean that
can
even
haunt
that
you
doesn't
and stick with you long after you watch the movie.
Yeah, and the fear of the familiar doesn't only apply to Grace Kelly because it also applies to the old schoolmate who comes because of their bond through this old acquaintance as school buddies, where they literally have like a picture together hanging on his wall, although that's very intentionally placed.
In both cases, he manipulates. The villain manipulates his close relationship to people. Oh, and real quick, now that you mentioned the reunion photo on the wall, that's actually our cameo that we see about 13 minutes and 13 seconds into the movie. Hitchcock is in the picture. He doesn't do picture cameos very often, but he did it here and in Lifeboat. But he was in the reunion photo on the left side of the frame, not lower center. That's The Shining. That's a different episode.
I know, yeah, it's a little bit like The Shining, though.
Yeah, right? I was thinking the same thing when they pulled that out this time I watched it, but not quite. Also, just because you're talking about Grace Kelly as being the wrong woman, I want to bring up kind of like this interesting, very artsy piece that pops up in this film for a very short moment where Grace Kelly is being accused or being tried. I can't remember exactly what's going on, but she's just kind of
but
like
it's all artsy.
Yeah, she's just kind of like in front of this red background. It feels like something you might see out of Vertigo. That's very artsy.
Honestly, it reminded me of those kind of abstract backgrounds that they put behind you for a school photo.
That's exactly what it looks like, but it's much more dramatically lit,
Right.
I almost kind of wish we had those bright red backgrounds rather than like the boring like gray, slate blue
Gray
thing.
one.
Because that would be real dramatic. Like make everybody look like a convicted killer in the yearbook. That'd be great. Convicted Killer Yearbooks now available at the Filmlinks/store. Except not really. So yeah. I mean, those deep themes, again, like Hitchcock is very much considered, or in his time was very much considered like a commercial guy. He wasn't considered like a high art director. in his time, but these themes he tackled are very deep and close to the center of what makes us human and what we are typically afraid of being misunderstood, of the threat of the unknown and the threat of the things that we think we know, but maybe we really don't. So, just lose some sleep over those thoughts. And Jonathan, I think you wanted to talk about some of the technical aspects of the movie.
Yeah, because we've been talking very highly of this film, and I think a lot of people do. They put it pretty high up on his list of movies. This one doesn't have a ton of shortcomings. Like you said, it's very entertaining to watch, even though it is a chamber piece per se. But those same elements are what makes Hitchcock not very fond of this film, because essentially, and this is adapted from a stage play, and that's essentially what it is like a filmed play that all takes place in one location. And using Hitchcock's own phrase, I promise he said this, he said he could have phoned this movie in because the...
Do you get it? It's fun. It's fun.
Because the film is driven by dialogue and not so much by the cinematics of the film. But there are some still very good Hitchcockian moments of the film. Like, again, like you said, the camera movement during all the dialogue scenes really works. And he uses these high angles and these things that really just spice up what otherwise would be just really boring coverage of a scene. But the murder scene, which is the fulcrum of this whole movie, is so Hitchcockian and so perfect that it definitely kind of elevates it and brings in those cinematics that Hitchcock is known for. Because it's even described whenever the husband is describing the scenario of the murder. He says he's going to call her in the middle of the night. All the lights will be off. She'll turn the light on in her room and open the door. And then this stream of light will come through. And you need to be hiding behind the curtain in the shadows so she doesn't see you in the light. And that's exactly what happens. And then there's she leaves the fire on. So there's this really warm glow. And then there's this streak of white light across this otherwise dark room or really low red room. And this is all happening while she starts being strangled. And then we have these really interesting low angles and Dutch angles of him strangling her and her stabbing him in the back and then him falling and impaling himself further with the scissors. And it's just really beautiful, dark situation. And then she steps outside and we have this nice high angle. And again, it's just one of those things that all goes into how good Hitchcock is at filming murder. There's actually a quote by Francois Truffaut, not from the interview or the book, but from when Hitchcock was getting his Lifetime Achievement Award from the AFI, and Truffaut gave a short speech, and he says, "You Americans like Hitchcock because he films love scenes like scenes of murder. We French like Hitchcock because he films scenes of murder as if they were love scenes." And I think that's just a really fun way that kind of encapsulates all of Hitchcock's filmmaking. He's so intentional and precise about everything that he films that you can just feel his touch on everything, and specifically those murder scenes that all of his films kind of revolve around.
Yeah, and there is a very close link between the murders and the passionate in everything he does, and we will see that big time in Psycho here when we get to that pretty soon. But yeah, no, it's interesting that he doesn't like this film after it turned out so well, and maybe it's because he just wasn't very interested in the topic. Maybe he thought that was a boring idea. He didn't like being confined. I mean, he had already kind of done his big chamber piece when he did Rope a few years before Dial M for Murder.
And he had done Lifeboat, which is also can be considered a chamber piece.
Yeah, so he kind of already done the whole chamber piece set when he got to Dial M for Murder. But kudos to his professionalism and his skill, because even if he wasn't that interested in it or didn't quite like it, it still turned out really well. Yeah. For a project he didn't like, it still turned out very well. And, by the time we get to this murder in this film, the attempted murder and, actual murder that takes place, we've retraced this crime a couple times at least with the characters already who have been planning it out. in seeing it and have gone over it in such meticulous detail. And again, that's kind of what I was talking about beforehand, where in the last film, Strangers on a Train, where a crime movie can situate itself on the plot of one particular crime, especially this perfect crime movie that just rehashes it over and over and over, and we hear different people's theories, and we see different people's reactions to it and the things that go wrong, and we're sitting in this omniscient position as the audience, because we see everything that happens, everything that goes wrong, every mistake that is made, every thought that is planned, every theory that is supposed, both through the expression of the characters and the movement of the characters. And so the drama for us is watching these characters trying to catch up to where we're at. For the last half of the movie, and for the first half of the movie, the drama is what's going to happen, because, I mean, there's part of it that's like, this plan is so precise, like, how is it going to go wrong? But also there's part of us that, just being curious human beings, that wants to see if they're actually going to be able to pull this off.
Right. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that you bring up the omniscience, because, again, that goes into how information is revealed. And the interesting thing is that we stay with all of the action that's happening inside the room. So that gives us the planning, so we know what is going to happen. So we know, both what is going to happen and what is happening, whereas none of the characters know that. Grace Kelly doesn't know what has already been planned and what is supposed to be happening to her when she gets that phone call. And the husband doesn't know what is happening in the room when he calls her and hears the struggling. So we are getting both sides of this. We know more than Grace Kelly and more than the husband, and especially at the end when they start figuring out everything, we're put very much more in the position of Grace Kelly. But basically, we're giving all the information, and we're seeing all the holes that the characters don't have. So in this case, there's not a lot of like twists or surprises. It's just kind of us. I guess the only perspective that we don't have in this film is that of the lieutenant. Whenever he is not in the apartment, the lieutenant starts to figure things out, and we don't get all of what he knows until we come back. We just know what actually happened. We don't know how much of that he knows.
All right, guys, it's time for our final movie of the day, Psycho from 1960. And, just real quick side story about Alfred Hitchcock, not only as the film director, but as the presenter.
The publicist.
Alfred Hitchcock presents. He knew what was up. And, partially this was a publicity move, and partially this was generally he wanted people to enjoy his film a certain way. And he had it written into distribution contracts for theater chains and individual theaters that were going to play Psycho, that they had to have these cardboard cutouts up in their theater, and they had to carry out the policy on them. And that the cardboard cutout was of Alfred Hitchcock holding the sign that read the policy. And I'll just read that to you real quick. It's also on my Twitter if you want to check that out. Just going to plug my own Twitter real quick. We won't allow you to cheat yourself. You must see Psycho from beginning to end to enjoy fully. Therefore, do not expect to be admitted into the theater after the start of each performance of the picture. We say no one, and we mean no one, not even the manager's brother, the President of the United States, or the Queen of England. God bless her. So, seriously, no. They really wanted no spoilers getting out. They didn't want somebody to come in partway through the film. Because, well, it would be ruined if you come in after a certain point in time. And not only would it be ruined because the surprise would be revealed, but you'd probably be pretty confused if you come in past a certain point. And you're going to understand why in a second, because you've already seen the film. And if you haven't seen the film, just stop. Stop right now. Go watch it. Go watch it. It's like $3 to rent on Amazon. Go watch it.
And also, why have you not watched Psycho yet?
Like, why are you listening to this? Go watch it. Because seriously, we are going. It's so hard to talk about without spoiling it that we're going to have to spoil it, and I'm about to do it. And I'm really giving you this warning. Alfred Hitchcock gave you the warning from like 70 years ago, and now I'm giving you the warning. So stop. Go watch it. I'm assuming everybody who's still listening to this has watched it. Significant time has passed. I will now go into the plot of Psycho, which really I wouldn't say is that complicated. There's not that many beats. And then and spoil it all. So this is all about to be spoiled. Again, just quick warning. Spoilers. Okay, cool. So we start off the film in this hotel room in Phoenix, Arizona, with a boyfriend and a girlfriend, Sam Loomis and Marion Crane. Please note Marion Crane's last name because there's like a subtle bird thing in this movie that will come to full fruition in another movie, The Birds, which we've already talked about on this podcast. Anyway, they are in a bit of a predicament. They very much love each other, but Sam is partially in debt, and plus he has to pay alimony to his ex-wife. And so they can't really afford to get married at the moment, and they live in different places. He lives in a place called Fairview, and I don't actually know where that is, but it's a fair decent drive away. And so they've been traveling back and forth to see each other, and they've gotten to that point in the relationship where they don't want to be long distance anymore. They want to get married and live together, but money is a problem. And so they don't really manage to resolve their issue. They kind of just continue on as is, but we now know what the central problem at the start of the movie is. Okay, so then Marion goes into work at her office, which is maybe some kind of bank, some kind of financial institution. Her coworker there is played by Patricia Hitchcock, and her boss comes in, followed by a rich man who's wearing like a cowboy hat, and he's dropping money on a house for his daughter, $40,000 in cash. And after, kind of this extended scene where they go back and forth and you get to see the characters interact, Marion is entrusted with the money to go to the bank, and she says she has a headache, so she's just going to stay home after she goes to the bank. And then we go to her room where she is packing to go. She's going to jet off with this money, and so she does. She's leaving the town in her car, but she stopped at a red light, and her boss and the guy who is making the big payment through them pass by her car, and the boss stops and sees her in the car, looks puzzled, and moves on with his day, but it ends up being important later on. Anyway, she drives off. She's going to go to Fairview with the money to help Sam pay off his debts and pay off the alimony, and then they can get married. But along the way, she runs into some problems. She gets stopped by a cop after she pulls over to take a nap along the side of the road. The cop follows her to a place where she...
because she has the worst poker face in the world.
Oh, no, she's terrible. Like, she thinks she's acting not suspicious, but everything she's doing is so suspicious. Which, just a quick tip, that's not how to avoid suspicion. But anyway, she there's an episode where she stops and exchanges her car for a different car, I think in an attempt to evade the cop, except the cop pulls up and watches her exchange the car, and then she's kind of stuck exchanging the car, and she finally gets away. But she gets caught in the rain, and she pulls over, as it turns out, only 15 miles outside of Fairview at a place called the Bates Motel.
Can I say something real quick? I think there was a line that I caught this time that I hadn't before, where the cop pulls her over the first time, and he's like, "You slept here all night? You should have just gone to a motel to be safe." And I was like, "Oh, okay."
Nice foreshadowing there. Yeah, no, there's beautiful foreshadowing in this film. This is a film that I really recommend multiple watch on. First of all, because the first one can be just so surprising that it can be hard to focus. And second of all, once you know all those twists, going back through it's a real treat to kind of see all the plants that are so subtle and so not noticeable. They're not delivered with a wink and a grin. They're just there as completely natural parts of conversation that you come back to.
Or at least they're put in there with a wink and a grin only to second-time viewers. Stuff that you don't see on the first time, and the second time you're like, oh, I see what you're doing.
Like when Norman Bates says that he likes stuffing things, and he's like, mother is a boy's best friend. And you're like, oh, well, that's odd, but that's nice. Like,
We all go a little mad sometimes, the famous line.
So anyway, she is at the Bates Motel. She sees somebody up in the house. Looks like an old woman up in a window, and she honks the horn because nobody's down by the motel. And a young man, Norman Bates, runs out from the house, comes down and helps her, gets her situated. In room number 1, right by the front office, so that she can spend the night. As we see, he has a peephole between the office and room number 1, which is why he wanted her there. And he stares at her. We can see that he is clearly interested in her. They also have a very creepy conversation when they share some sandwiches together. We see that he has
It's like half innocuous and half kind of creepy.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's like, this could be pretty normal. Maybe this guy is just like an odd guy. Like, he doesn't get how to interact with people that well. Or, maybe he is really creepy. And as it turns out, he is definitely really creepy. They're surrounded by all these taxidermied birds that Norman Bates has stuffed. Which, hint, hint, wink, wink. Remember that. And they have this really awkward conversation, and then Marion goes back to her room, and she's like counting the money to try to see, I don't know, she's doing math with it. She's trying to figure out how much to use for this and that.
I think during the conversation, she's decided to go back and return the money. And because she says something about, like, I stepped into a private trap back there and I want to go make it right. So she writes down all the things that she's already spent. So how much of the $40,000 is not there for whenever she goes back.
How much she would owe in order to replace it full. I gotcha. Right. I gotcha. Okay. Well, anyway, she is going about her business. By the way, she flushes that piece of paper down the toilet. That is the first on-screen flush of a toilet. Not the first on-screen toilet. First on-screen flush of a toilet in cinema history. Apparently. That's the best, to the best of my knowledge. That's what I've been told. Maybe there's some obscure art film. I wouldn't be shocked. But
I'm sure Buñuel filmed a flushing toilet at some point.
I mean, he definitely filmed toilets plenty. Anyway, she's going about her business. She settles in to take a nice, relaxing shower, and then cue string music. But anyway, the shower is rudely interrupted by a woman with a knife who stabs her to death in maybe one of the most famous scenes of cinema ever. That you just know about. Even if you don't know what the movie's from, like, you know about this scene. And quick fun fact, that was done with chocolate syrup because it's in black and white.
The blood.
The blood. And even though it's in black and white and it's chocolate syrup, a lot of people will say that they remembered the red very vividly in the scene. And I think that's a nice hint at, making the audience do some work. Part of we remember things better when we make them up, which is weird, but it is true, and we just insert that visceral red into the scene, and it makes us engage with the scene a little bit more than it would have if maybe it was in color. Just a fun fact, share that chocolate syrup fact next time you're in an ice cream party. I'm sure it'll go over real well with the rest of the attendees.
Yeah, I think that scene took like a week to shoot because there were like 30 different setups or something, because every shot is a different camera setup, basically.
Yeah. Janet Leigh only spent 3 weeks on this film shooting it, and 1 week, 1/3 of that time was the shower scene. Just because, they they have almost like 360 coverage on her. It's pretty impressive.
I think there's actually like a body double in there for some of it, just because of the nudity and whatever as far as filming it, which doesn't actually like make it into the thing, just based on the way that they set up the camera and the focus and everything. It's actually like
they do some clever things with depth of field.
Yeah, it's kind of an expert class in how to show nudity without showing nudity.
If that's your goal for a scene, they pull it off real well. And also impressive way that they got it past the censors, or it's just impressive that they got it past the censors. I don't know exactly how they did that.
I think probably with Psycho, like the original script was so much worse that just getting it down to what was shown eventually was kind of a goal for the censors.
So they were still able to get some in there, but not the worst of the worst. I gotcha. Okay, well, if that was done intentionally, that was incredibly clever. Old bait and switch, Norman Bates joke. Okay, so now Marion is very, very dead, and we see the house, and we hear Norman Bates scream out something about blood, and then we see him burst out of the house, and it makes it really sound like he's talking to another person.
He also screams about mother.
Yeah, he screams
mother,
about mother.
The blood.
And he runs down, he sees her, and there's a very long cleanup sequence where we see him meticulously get rid of the body.
This film takes its time in such a perfect way.
It really does. And he gets rid of her body and the money and the car in a swamp.
He doesn't even know that there was money. She had wrapped it in a newspaper, and he just picked it up with the rest of her stuff.
Yeah. It was just one of her things that he happened to be getting rid of. And he dumps it in a swamp. We see the car sinking into the mud, and we see him in a very sinister low angle, standing over the car. And at this point, it's still not really revealed what's actually going on, but suddenly our entire narrative has shifted, because what we thought was going to be the main focus of this movie, this woman who has run away with this money, and what is she going to do, has suddenly stopped because she's dead.
She's completely irrelevant now.
She's completely, well, I mean, she's not completely irrelevant, but she's completely dead. 100% dead. Not, you're just mostly dead. There's no Miracle Max in this movie. So at this point, our narrative shifts to Sam Loomis in his shop in Fairview, and Marion's sister, Lila, coming in to ask him where the heck her sister is, and Sam has no idea either. They both are pretty clueless at this. And then a detective walks in, Detective Arbogast, who is also on this case, and he's on the case because of the missing money, which is something that neither Sam or Lila knew about. So both Sam and Lila are looking for Marion because, well, they have personal relationships with her, and Arbogast is after her because she stole this money and ran away. And they're pretty sure that Marion is somewhere near or around Fairview, and eventually Arbogast ends up at the Bates Motel and confronts Norman Bates about it and questions him, and these really, really tense scenes in this back and forth where we're wondering what's really going on. We think at this point that Norman Bates is covering for his mom.
He's being super shady, intense, and Arbogast is being a little standoffish, but also prying pretty hard.
Yeah, and so Arbogast is getting really curious about this mom character, and he figures he's going to sneak up to the house and see her. And so
it's important that we've seen her in the mirror. I mean, in the window.
Yeah, we've seen her in the window during the shower scene. We see this woman with a knife, and we're defining. We're saying we see a woman because we see like a dress, we see hair that is a signature like 1960s style female haircut. That's what we're really going off of here to cue into the fact that she's a woman, along with the fact that Norman Bates is referring to her as his mother. He talks about his mother. She's around. So even though we haven't seen her, she's just mysterious. And at this point in the film, it could really be a thing where it actually is the mom, but we're just keeping her off of the camera to make her scarier. But it ends up going completely
like a
direction.
Jaws kind of thing, yeah.
Like a Jaws kind of thing, but it's not a Jaws kind of thing. It's a Psycho kind of thing. So Arbogast goes up to the house to see the mom, and another famous murder scene. He's walking up the stairs, and then suddenly, just like it's a totally normal thing to do, the mom walks right out of her bedroom and stabs Arbogast across the face and into the chest, and he stumbles back down the stairs and dies. So what had seemed like over the past 20 or 30 minutes, like it was developing into the new focus of the film, where Arbogast and our other characters, Sam and Lila, were going to suss out this mystery and figure out what was going on, has suddenly stopped because Arbogast is now dead. And now it's down to Sam and Lila. In the meantime, before Sam and Lila really investigate the murder and the Bates Motel, we see, or at least we see Anne here, Norman Bates talking to his mom about moving her downstairs for her own safety, hiding her in the basement, and we see what looks like him it is him carrying his mom out of his mom's room and down the stairs. In the meantime, Sam and Lila continue their investigation because now Arbogast has gone missing too, and they're not hearing anything. So they didn't really want to get the police involved since, obviously their respectively their girlfriend and their sister was wanted for stealing 40 grand. But eventually, it's gotten to this point where they have to. And they go to the local sheriff to see if he might know anything, if he can help. And it's at this point that we find out that about 10 years ago, Norman Bates' mother and her boyfriend both died in an apparent murder-suicide. So all this talk about the mother seems very mysterious. And so Sam and Lila end up going to investigate the Bates Motel. And Sam distracts Norman Bates while Lila goes up to the house to investigate the house and see if she can find the mom. Meanwhile, Norman Bates catches on and knocks Sam out cold and goes back up to the house. Lila finally makes it to the basement and sees a woman in a chair facing away from her, and she turns around the chair in this wonderfully tense, slow scene, but like in that slow that's a really delicious, good kind of slow. Spins her around, and it's this mummified face of the mom. She's been dead the whole time, which that face it has, the first time I saw it, it gave me nightmares for like 2 weeks. Yeah. And it's real gross. And so she screams, and then suddenly Norman Bates, dressed as his mom, bursts in the room with a knife to attack Lila. But thankfully Sam is right behind him and tackles him to the ground and pulls the knife away. Wig
the
comes
face
off
he
in the
makes
process.
is so... it's just so disturbing, and like he's like bursting out of this nightgown, and it's really striking image in the way that just like the tableau of the scene is built.
Yeah, and plus like the basement has been lit by like this hanging light, and somebody at the start of the struggle the hanging light was knocked around, so it's swinging around, casting all of these funky moving shadows over these two people as they struggle, and as we see this weird merger between Norman Bates and this other personality that he has within him that's like his mom, or like a simulation of his mom, kind of. Anyway, we at this point, the mystery has been unraveled, and we see them talk after in the wrap up of the crime, and they kind of explain what happened. There's this great monologue by the psychiatrist who explains everything to our main characters. And explains that Norman Bates killed his mom and his mom's boyfriend, and out of guilt he dug up his mom's body, and he has that taxidermy habit, and he taxidermied his mom, and then sometimes emulates his mom, and eventually became like another personality within him. And apparently he's killed 2 other girls in the past, in addition to Marion, and then eventually Detective Arbogast, who he killed on the stairs. And then the movie ends with this wonderful scene where Norman Bates is just sitting in a chair, and we hear his inner thoughts. And it's like the mother personality is completely taken over. And it is just, that's the real defining Psycho moment, I think, of the movie, where you can't come away from that scene and not be like, whoa, that's a psychopath. And the mother's talking about hiding within him, and how Norman Bates is, I can't really describe it and do it any justice. You need to see it. And if you're here listening to this right now, you've already have seen it. Unless you did the dumb thing and listened to this without having watched it, which I'm sorry, I warned you a whole bunch. But anyway, that's kind of the plot of Psycho. And
real quick, as long as we're at the end, the defining moment of the film for me is it lasts a couple frames, and it is the moment when the shot of Norman Bates's face fades to the shot of the car from Marion's car being dragged out of the lake that he pushed it in. And for a split second, as his face starts to fade away, the mummified face fades in, like on top, superimposed with his own face. And it is just so disturbing and so short that if you're not watching, you'll miss it. And if you are watching, you won't forget it. It's kind of just this incredible, tiny little detail that Hitchcock throws in there that's really unnerving.
Yeah, it's real subtle, and it's really good. And, if it had been too much longer than it already was, it would have been, like, campy.
Yeah,
but
cheesy.
As subtle as it is, like, it's really good. And so that's Psycho, really. And as you can see, that's kind of why they you have all these spoiler warnings. Not only are the big surprises kind of, part of the fun part of watching the movie, but, if you had come in at the 45-minute mark instead of the 40-minute mark and Janet Leigh was already dead, you would not understand the movie. You would think it's about... you'd think it's like this detective movie with Detective Arbogast looking into this missing woman and this murderer and this psycho, and you would have no idea that the first 40 minutes of the movie were spent with this character who's now dead.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. And before we get too far into it, let's get some of the cameo stuff out of the way. The Hitchcock cameo comes at 6 minutes and 59 seconds. It's basically 7 minutes into the movie. And he can be seen through the office window of the office where Janet Leigh works. And he is wearing a cowboy hat. And that's kind of at the point where Janet Leigh walks into the office, if you kind of really want to time it. But, there you go. Hitchcock in a cowboy hat. And of course, there's another Hitchcock in the movie. Patricia Hitchcock plays the other secretary of the bank/financial institution of the film, who works alongside Janet Leigh, and her character's name is Caroline. She's kind of already married. She's kind of like this comedic character in the scene. After this guy who's dropping 40 grand on the house kind of flirts with Janet Leigh and then leaves, Caroline comes over and is kind of like, oh, he must have seen my wedding ring. And we're all like, sure.
It's kind of funny. She kind of has mother issues too, just hinted at, because she's like, oh, my husband, Teddy. And then who called? Oh, Teddy called. My mother called to see if Teddy called.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so we've already put this tiny little hint of overbearing mother just in one tiny line, and it's already setting it up.
Yeah, it's a good setup, and also I think that Hitchcock just thinks everybody has mother issues, so
right.
So it might have just been a completely natural take. Who knows? Although it was going to be in the script. If it was Hitchcock, it was in the script. So
yeah,
so that's fair. Anyway, that's the plot. That's the cameos. There you go. That's a lot of information to take in right there. Just as the reveal, but yeah, and also I want, before we get too into the results, I want to get into kind of the way the production was approached by Hitchcock. I've heard that he was kind of sick of doing really large productions at this point. He wasn't feeling like doing that, so he kind of worked mostly with TV crews and kind of the stripped down version. At this point, he had already started and was getting interested in his Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show, and so it kind of has this stripped down production feel where it doesn't feel quite as, it definitely doesn't feel as glossy. Of thinking about the toilet,
right,
as a big Hollywood production, it doesn't feel as grand as a big Hollywood production. It has a somewhat grittier, more realistic feel that was really going to become big in the 70s, with really gritty, realistic 70s movies. But this is a bit ahead of its time in that concept, but it has lasting power, even though it's kind of a stripped down, cheaper production.
Yeah, and it's still beautifully shot and just masterfully crafted. There are some, as far as black and white cinematography goes, this is one of my favorite films as far as that. And there's one of my favorite shots in the film is just it's one of it's not like one of the big shots that everyone is would normally think about, but it's this point where Arbogast is looking at the ledger of people who've checked in to try and find Marion on there, and Norman Bates leans over to look at it also, but the camera pans with him even though we're not seeing his face, and we're seeing just like his chin and throat, which has a very prominent Adam's apple, and it's this really strange shot with lots of weird shadows on Norman Bates that kind of disfigures him into this weird like monster almost looking thing just because of this. It's an angle that no one would ever shoot like at someone's throat, and then he moves back into his normal shot, and it's just like this little tiny, again, these little details that Hitchcock piles up that create this perfect subconscious feeling. And I think that this is Hitchcock's like most psychological film, both in terms of digging into his character's psychology and also messing with the psychology of the audience, and he just does it brilliantly.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, he completely baffles the audience. I mean, we were talking about in Dial M for Murder, you know, at what point the audience is in terms of knowledge compared to the characters. And in Dial M for Murder, they're completely omniscient. In Psycho, we're, you know, it's odd because we're kind of omniscient too in terms of the camera, but the character who has the secret is also completely crazy. So he 100% he acts out the reality that is being portrayed. So the secret's completely hidden, and there's no hint given that he's acting this out until you get to the point where it's revealed.
I think as far as our information of Norman Bates, we are omniscient as far as Norman Bates himself is. We know as much as Norman does, which is that his mother is very overbearing, this old invalid lady who sometimes comes down and kills anyone that he gets interested in. And that's all that Norman knows about the situation because of his, this split personality thing in his brain. And that's all that we are given. And so we're given more about Marion and her situation, which ends up being irrelevant. And it's one of the greatest things about the movie is that first plot twist of Marion dying a third of the way through the film, that we've spent so much time and so much tension has been built to just be released and never brought up again. Like, the money is perfect because Hitchcock is like slapping his audience in the face with this MacGuffin. He uses his MacGuffin in the way that every MacGuffin ever has been used, and then he just slaps us in the face and says, no, that was totally unimportant. He literally just brings that up at the end. So what happened with the money? Oh, it didn't matter. This was a crime of passion. He ended up being blindsided by something completely else. And it's also interesting that as soon as that happens, as soon as Marion dies, she becomes the MacGuffin that drives her sister and her boyfriend. And so it's again, Hitchcock knows how he structures his film and how everyone else structures films, and then he is able to use that and lead the audience right up onto this carpet and pull it out from under them. And this is one of the best examples ever of that.
Yeah, and he does a great job of setting tones without giving it away, which is a good job of doing foreshadowing. And I think my favorite example is definitely the conversation over the sandwiches in the room full of birds.
Yes, exactly.
Mostly because the birds are, A, ridiculous, and 2, I always wonder what Hitchcock's deal with birds is. Is he
Right.
scared of them? Does he have a bird complex? Anyway, but it's got these perfect foreshadowing bits where Norman Bates is talking about how he likes to stuff things, and like he mummified his mother, and he's talking about how every boy's best friend is his mom. But they're delivered and they're presented in such a way that it just makes it look like this is an odd, strange guy. It doesn't make it look like these are hints at something bigger. They feel like ends in themselves. Like they feel like the finished fact delivered to the audience. They don't feel like a half fact delivered to the audience. That will be revealed later on. Like there's no tension building mystery in the presentation of those facts, but they set the tone just right for when those facts to be revealed, that they are just spectacular, and they make sense too. Because if you hadn't set the tone, I think we should mention this, like if you hadn't set the tone for this to be a weird, creepy mama's boy before we revealed that he was impersonating his mom the entire time, it would be a shocking twist in a bad way, where suddenly the movie doesn't make sense anymore. And I think we've all had that experience in a film where you're watching it and then suddenly it stopped making sense. So the twists fit into the movie without derailing the movie. And not only is there one big twist that accomplishes that, but there's like two or three, or over the course of the film that happen, and you don't expect them anytime that they happen. You get the sense that something's going to happen, but not too strongly. And I think there's an interesting story that you were talking about with Saul Bass about that, right, Jonathan?
Yeah, so Saul Bass did the title sequence on Psycho, as he did with North by Northwest and Vertigo, and plenty of other films. Like, just type in Saul Bass and you will get a montage of the greatest title sequences in film history. But he asked Hitchcock if he could work on a scene in Psycho, and I think Hitchcock had a day where he had to be out or something, and so he gave this scene where Arbogast goes into Norman Bates's house and is killed to Saul Bass, and so he covered it and edited it, and then Hitchcock looked at it and he was like, "This is no good because it's got too much tension in it." Which sounds weird. Like, okay, Hitchcock is all about tension, and Saul Bass had filmed Arbogast's feet going up the stairs, and a close up on his hand on the rail, and all the things that you think about when you think about a tense scene of someone going up the stairs, which there are a lot of in Hitchcock films, I realize. But Hitchcock's thinking is, okay, so all the scary stuff has already happened. The woman's already been killed. She's already been chased by the police, and all the tension has already happened. He's just going up to talk to an old lady. There shouldn't be that much tension in this scene. So Hitchcock basically recuts it or recovers it, I don't remember, and we just watch him walk up the stairs. He's just walking into an old house, and then we go to the super high angle of the woman coming out, and then we punch into the close-up. And that's another thing that Hitchcock is really adamant about in terms of covering a scene, where typically you have your master shot and then you shoot your close-ups and then you just kind of switch between those to keep interest. But Hitchcock often talks about how you need to keep your shots wide, because if you use too many close-ups, you lose the power when you really need a close-up. And this is one of those examples where we're wide on him going up the stairs, we're wide from the top of the mom coming out and stabbing, and then we punch into the close-up as the knife comes down of his face with the slash across it, and then he falls down the stairs. And so it's just Hitchcock being so intentional about everything, including cinematography and blocking, even to just when you place a cut for the maximum impact.
Yeah, and you know what? It's a perfect example of how you have to mix up your techniques and have a wide enough selection of techniques and knowledge in filmmaking to use the right one when it's time for it.
Yeah.
Because I think it could be easy to misinterpret advice you get in film school, or even advice you can get from a podcast like this, as every single technique that we bring up, you have to use all the time, which isn't true. It isn't true. And honestly, if you did, it would be overstuffed. Every scene would be too much. It would be, it would be way, way too complicated. Rather, it's more of a matter of selecting the right tool for the right job. And in this case, the right tool was, luring the audience into a false sense of security so that the shock value of the mom killing another person is all the more shocking, because we've already had a shocking murder. We don't need more tension build. Like that would just be giving it away. That would be descending into cheesy horror camp. And that's not, I mean, it is a horror movie, but it isn't a horror movie, you know?
Yeah, it's like not, high horror, if that's a if that's a category we can create.
Like it's not, like there's horror elements to it, but the movie making isn't about horrifying the audience, you know? Yeah. Like the goal isn't to terrify the audience every single moment. There's a couple really scary moments, and one that haunted my nightmares. But other than that, like it's a wonderful mystery, suspense thriller movie, and so it could have easily have been too much in the horror direction, you know, and Hitchcock pulled back in the right moments to really make it work.
And I think there's something interesting that you brought up, just to backtrack a little bit, as far as, you know, taking all of these things that we talk about, even just on the podcast, and just making sure that like everything is case specific, you know, it depends. And I think just the fact that we're talking about the twists in this film and how well the twists are done is in contrast with what we talked about with Vertigo, because in Vertigo we talked about how sometimes you can spoil the twist and draw out an hour of suspense. That's not the case in this film. You know, if Hitchcock had told us that Norman Bates was his mother, you know, it wouldn't have the same, I don't think it would be as tense as Vertigo is whenever he does that and spoils it. I think that keeping the audience just going on this journey with the other characters and only revealing what they know, and then, yes, giving us those twists, even the twist ending, because it, you know, I think that the first two twists kind of set up the last twist to be even stronger, because it's like, okay, how many times can you put a twist in this movie? But that last twist, again, it gives a rewatch value, like we talked about when we're talking about effective twists. That's what it does. It makes you go back and be watching for all of those little hints that you missed the first time. And even just the things like the bird symbolism, you know, the fact that her name is Marion Crane, the fact that he stuffs birds and there's a hawk above him the whole time and like a raven above her. And then when Norman comes in and sees her dead, he falls and knocks a bird picture off of the wall. So there's just so much stuff into this film that, you know, the way that he uses the twists and everything is just even more enjoyable to watch it again and again and again.
Yeah, and definitely, you know, if you're studying this for techniques that you want to use in your own stuff, it can be, especially with films, and this is ironic because the best films to study are often the most dazzling, the most engrossing, the most easy to get lost in and forget why you're watching them.
Right, exactly.
So, and this is definitely a great case of that, where you can get lost in the movie, and you can totally miss all of the really wonderful techniques that are used over the course of the film. And then you go back the second time and you notice all of that stuff, because you start to wonder, if you're a filmmaker or an aspiring filmmaker, you have that switch in your brain that you turn on that isn't just, oh, that's cool. It's, oh, how did I make that cool? How did they make that cool? How can I in the future make my own stuff that cool? And you start looking for those techniques the second time around. And plus, you know, now that you know the ending, like you said, you know, you catch those things like, oh, every boy's mother is his best friend. Everybody goes a little bit mad sometimes, that have like a much different meaning the second time you watch the movie and you know this true significance of lines. And you may be wondering, and let's slide into overall notes for this bit, and you may be wondering, how do you know when to use what technique? Because we just went through that whole spiel. How do you know when to use what technique, what each scene needs? And that's really the trick, I think, because
that's what separates the good directors from the whatever directors.
Yeah, because anybody can really learn these techniques. Anybody can learn, how to edit a scene well, how to block a scene well, how to coach actors correctly, how to light a scene well. What's gonna
In a general sense.
In a general sense, you can achieve a good aesthetic quality, but how to connect that good aesthetic quality to the meaning of the film, or even if it's not like a film with like a message, then just the theme of the film or the central idea or question, whatever the film is focused around, how to connect it all together and then conduct each scene so that the tension rises in the right place and falls in the right place, and you lure the audience into comfort in the right place and then shock them in the next. That's really the trick of learning to become a great director, and it's hard and it takes some time, and not everybody can do it, but it can be a worthwhile endeavor if you're up to the task of studying it. And one of the best ways to learn how to do that is to study the people who are really, really good at it, and learn and watch their movies and dive into their movies and hear what they had to say about their movies, why they did certain things. Watching the stair scene where Arbogast is killed is one thing. You can see it and you can maybe reproduce it, but then listening to why Hitchcock did what he did in the scene, you get it and you understand it, and then maybe you can replicate it in your own meaningful way in your own future work down the line.
Yeah. And I think now that we're in overall notes, just talking about villains, because that is the point of this podcast, I think the interesting thing here is that, at least in our first two films, what we have is something that is typically kind of tropey, which is the bad guy giving away their whole plot, either to the person who has the power to foil them or just to the audience. And these are like perfect examples of how to do it without being just the bad guy who has the good guy tied up. This is a way to convey information in a way that is very interesting, which is, in the first place, put it at the beginning of the movie. If we know what the bad guy's planning at the beginning of the movie, and he's either telling it to his instrument, or I guess in both cases, it's his intended instrument of that plan. And then that lets us in on, what is going to be working and what is going to be happening throughout the rest of the film. And again, it just like sets us up on this hill of tension. And then once that plot that was discussed starts happening, then we're rolling down this hill and we're just waiting for the bumps and see what happens. And then Psycho is different though, because there is
Psycho's different from most movies.
It's different from most movies because we're following this villain, and it's one of cinema's greatest villains. But we're not able to get into his head until the very end, because he's not even in his own head. None of this is actually like planned out. Like, as they say at the end, it's crimes of passion. And again, he's better at getting away with it than anyone else, but it's because it's more out of necessity than because he has this master plan.
It's so crazy that he acts out the cover-ups. He walks
exactly
around the window silhouetted, and he talks to his mom when other people aren't around. He covers his own tracks, but unintentionally, just because he's that crazy. The reason that he kills is the same reason that he's so good with getting away with it. Yeah,
and it's just interesting in contrast with these, where we're given this whole plan, this whole like extremely thought out plan. The fact that he doesn't even know. He doesn't know that he's the one that's doing it, and so the audience doesn't either. So you have both of those dynamics in these films, and it's just really interesting ways to portray villains. And again, going back to our phrase for the day, the stronger the villain, the stronger the film. And these are three of Hitchcock's most notorious villains in his films, or films that revolve so heavily around the mind of the bad guy. We're not in the shoes of the sympathetic everyman who's in the wrong situation. We are just being dragged through the muck of human just malice and just mean people.
Yeah, like some straight up evil, like just bad people. Bad all around.
Sometimes that's what we want to watch, and it's interesting, and then we're just glad that we're not them, hopefully.
All right, so next time on the podcast, for our last installment of the Hitchhike series. It's been a while since we started doing this, but it's finally the last week. We're going to be talking about the Hitchcock touch, kind of like a nice wrap-up summary of all the things that make Hitchcock Hitchcock. And we're going to be covering some of the greatest or most interesting films, most unique films that he has that we haven't gotten to yet.
Yeah, and, on a technical level, mostly.
Yeah, and by no means have we covered all of his great films, because he has too many of them. But we certainly have taken quite a bit of a chunk. We'll hit 15 Hitchcock films by the end of this series alone, and 16 if you include that episode we did with Lifeboat way back when, almost this time last year.
Yep.
But next week we're going to be talking about Rope from 1948, another chamber piece. Rear Window from 1954, almost a chamber piece, kind of.
Yeah.
And then a near documentary, The Wrong Man from 1956, maybe the most stark and bleak portrayal of the wrong man plot that Hitchcock ever did. But it should be fascinating, and it should be fun to wrap up the series.
Yeah, so we've got the famous one-shot film, the interesting take on the chamber piece, which ends up becoming kind of a metaphor for cinema, and then Hitchcock's pseudo-documentary film. So we've got lots of different technical things to talk about next time, and I'm excited.
Yes, me too. And I'm sure our wonderful, wonderful sponsor, Truffaut's Ghost, is excited as well. He covered Hitchcock quite a deal, and he's been very excited to talk about it to us in our weekly seances. That's why we've been having to take a week off between episodes. We've been having to talk to the ghost.
Spoilers.
Spoilers, sorry. I didn't tell anybody how we get in contact with him. Spoilers, it does involve Criterion Blu-ray copies of his films. But anyway, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at @JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
The Film Links, sponsored by Truffaut's Ghost.
Like Hamlet's ghost. How do you say remember me in French? Souviens-toi de moi.
Souviens-toi de moi. Oh my gosh. French makes no sense as a language.